Okay, here we are back. My brain's trying to get started. I freaking ditched in the snow today. Let me turn this music off. I've been getting all nostalgic with Petula Clark. Been thinking about Nick Rowe. Anyway. So, Candace Owens. One of my followers made a comment that, what were my thoughts? He had a question about what were my thoughts about Candace Owens. Well, I've been watching the debate, and it's been very interesting because right when the military got brought in as to, like, how could they be involved in the Charlie Kirk? Oh, and before we segue into this, isn't it interesting that everything was about Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens and Alex Jones. And now suddenly, whoosh, Shazam, shell game change. It's all about Maduro and Venezuela. You should be really taking that point to heart, because that's what this game's all about. Remember what I was telling you about distraction and chaos. This is how this happens. Whether the players are actively part of the game or they're useful idiots. And in terms of useful idiots, I will be making comments about Tucker Carlson and Sean Ryan and what I know about them. Because I've got pretty fed up with all the bullshit that's going around. And I think you are too. I think that's what's happening this year, is that everybody's finally just getting fed up with how this is being played. And I think because it's just being played so poorly. Because, you know, back in the 50s and the 60s and the 40s, there is really a difference in generation. And it's not a change in generation of it being better. It's that I think every generation has continued to degrade. And people think it's just us peons, you know, we campesinos, we pueblos out in the field, we people who work in the industrial companies and et cetera, and the corporate world, that we are, in the minds of some, especially those in Silicon Valley, thinking that they're so much more intelligent than their predecessors. When in reality, we've had such a degrading, and I'm going to show how that was actually planned. But I think when it was planned, I didn't think that the smarter than everybody else people who came up with this crap back in the late well, actually it wasn't the late, it was the 1908 1907 time period in these boardrooms, who thought that we were just going to bring the whole world together. For some people, they thought, oh, that's going to be great because we're just going to kumbaya together. And then the ones who are really crafty are thinking, we can get them all under one tent, and then it's a lot easier to control them. Which Palantir and all this other stuff that's happening, that's why that should really freak you out, because that's actually the ideal of the dictator and the tyrant, is to have everybody tabulated and under control. So we're watching these two special forces guys, and then we've got a CIA case officer, pseudo case officer, but I just call him a member of the Mod Squad. Do you remember the Mod Squad? Yeah, it was all about hair. Andrew Bustamante, very interesting character. You'll find that a lot of people who are in the agency or have been in the agency have this ability to transform. It's kind of like my friend's mother made a comment about it. It was like, I came back from Asia and she says, God, you look like you're Vietnamese. And then I came back from when I got my my tribal name in Porcupine, you know, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And she said, God, you look like an Indian. So here we have Andrew Bustamante, and he's talking about the fighting between Dan Crenshaw and Sean Ryan. And man, Sean Ryan is a piece of cake. Did you know I was almost on his show way back when? This was about the time I was in Texas finishing up my commercial pilot licenses. And he'd been seeing my posts on Instagram and thought, wow, hey. And we started talking, and I thought, hey, we had a great conversation. And then something happened. Not just the idea that I said I was with the CIA in Central America, but it's something about Vietnam. And when he said that, I was just floored. But remember, I was also a drug and alcohol rehab counselor, so I'm very attuned and very attentive to people who have been damaged by cocaine. And I will be talking about that in a later episode. And why you should be concerned, because just like with Joe Rogan, for people to understand, there's actually a drug war, an opium war, just in the same manner that the Bank of England did against the Chinese back in the 1800s. It's now against us. It's been against the Russians, and it's been against the Chinese too, but the Chinese are pretty good about taking care of it. I'll tell you why I don't use drugs. I've never, quote, what's the word? I've never played with drugs. And it actually goes all the way back to my childhood of being raised in Singapore. I'll tell you a story about what it was like to be raised in Singapore, in a country where they would execute you if you had a certain amount. If you had a certain amount and above of heroin, which was basically being sold by the drug dealers in Singapore at that time in the 70s. If you were caught with it, you would be executed. And it's interesting that Trump has been talking about that. And you know what? I'll talk about it later, but that is one of the reasons I do not use drugs. And, but as a drug and alcohol rehab counselor, I understand the effects of what those substances can do, especially when they are taking in incredible amounts, especially cocaine, and what it does. The science behind this is very clear on what it does to your brain and the effects on your brain. But that'll be another episode, but the only reason I'm bringing this up right now is this influencers. Yeah, these former spec ops influencers, like the Andy Stumps, and you got the Sean Ryans, and you got I was liking him, you know, Valhalla VFT, and that other guy that's a Green Beret sniping instructor, shooting instructor. But when those two got together on Candace with the attitude like, oh, the Army would never get involved in this. Yeah. But this is the thing about Fort Huachuca. And this is the stuff. Again, if you weren't in this war. You wouldn't have gotten it. Yeah. God, man. It's wild. That the secret war, you know, as I've said before in previous comments, you know, my dad's war was the forgotten war. That was Korea. And then my war was the forgotten war. It was the secret war. And how efficiently, I mean, the secret war was what was won. We won the war against the Soviets. That was a war. We won it, and nobody knew. Think about what that does to those who were the combatants. What that does to those who had lost those they fought alongside. And this is the part I'm going to talk about with Fort Huachuca. And this is, first of all, PSYOPs training. If you're going in for some specialized PSYOPs training, you went to Fort Huachuca. It is a very, very good school, let me tell you. But there was something else that happened at Fort Huachuca throughout the war, going all the way back to, what was that paper? There was a paper, The Way Ahead by Richard V. Allen. He was Reagan's man, all the way back in 81. 81? Yeah. And that was the beginning of what would be called body washing. So body washing, what body washing is, or was, because remember, Reagan did not want anybody to really know what was happening in Central America, didn't know that we had a full-on war going on there, that it was all covert, it was secret. And it was basically, if you were to take Vietnam, and Vietnam was taken over, which would have been Honduras, and have all your military personnel stationed in, quote, Vietnam, and then you would have an actual conflict going on in another country, which you couldn't have the number of troops that you would have wanted to if you're going to do what Trump is probably going to try to do if he does it militarily, which is going to be insane, which is to send a whole freaking wave of troops into Venezuela. And it's just going to be a hornet's nest. It's just going to be all over the place. Unless all those Venezuelans who are, they say were chanting and running around in Miami, which they were, if they're willing to go back, I don't know if they're willing to go back. I think once you've got a taste of all that free money in the U.S., especially when you're a refugee, things don't look so good about going back to where you came from. That's the problem. That was the problem from way back, of getting it to a point where suddenly the United States became the receptory for everybody else's people who didn't fit in where they were or were persecuted. And that if you could just get here, you were on the streets of gold. That was actually the propaganda we were giving the Soviets, remember, back in the 50s and 60s. So, when our troops were being killed in combat in Central America, and they were recovered, that's a key point, and they were recovered, they were brought back to the States, and they went to Fort Huachuca. And at Fort Huachuca, because they got lots and lots of land, and they have a lot of exercises, they can just put a body in a helicopter and fire a bunch of rounds into that helicopter or blow up that helicopter. Suddenly, an SF operator, a ranger, an airborne, because I know there were airborne guys, 82nd Airborne was there. And man, especially towards the end, I got a friend, he was an RTO, and he was assigned to a special forces team. And so he was fighting alongside. So 82nd Airborne was there. I don't know if the 101st was. Rangers were there. SEAL Team 4 was there. So that's East Coast. Green Beret Special Forces 7th Group, because that's their territory. And then CIA. And everybody wants a piece of pie, because when you can say, hey, we were doing this and this and this, when the next budget comes out, hopefully more money comes in. It's all about the money. And the sad part is, who knows how many of the relatives don't know that their loved ones may have actually died valiantly, worthy of a Bronze Star with valor, V for valor, or maybe a Medal of Honor. Definitely a Purple Heart. But this is the way secret wars, covert wars, and all these things that happen, which are never to have happened according to our Constitution. But Fort Huachuca is a center of a lot of this covert content. And the problem with covert is that covert can be hijacked. You get a warning order, you get a request, you get a directive, and you're taught not to question it, just go with it, let's do it, what's got to be done. So who knows what was happening? And remember, This thing, everybody wants to talk about the CIA, and the CIA is all about the military-industrial complex. But did anybody forget the M in military-industrial complex? Military? Do you honestly think that the CIA has like this stranglehold on funds and money? Or did you never read Smedley Butler, Medal of Honor winner, Marine officer from World War I? War's a Racket. You should read that if you haven't read it. Breaks it right down. It's funny. It's like the people who really work for the government, really have been in the military, have really gone off to wars, are the ones that come back and say, what a crock. Or in the words of Smedley, what a racket. But the question is, how much longer are the American people going to be standing by, allowing your tax dollars to pay for things that not only do not defend your country? The United States government is charged with basically only one thing: defending the U.S. citizens and defending our borders. That's it. That is it. Everything else that happens, that's supposed to actually be determined and defined by the states. The federal government is really just supposed to be an administration who is supposed to administer what you and I tell them to do. It's not leadership. They are not our leaders. You're supposed to be the leader. But leadership requires responsibility. And so many of generation after generation, see the weakest link when they talk about the weakest link in the chain? The weakest link in the chain is the human propensity to use the least amount of energy to get something done. And if you can get somebody else to do that for you, so much the better. And it actually fits with your genetic precondition, your genetic programming to save energy. It's just like a trout. The biggest fat trout when you're fly fishing, it's the one that gets right in the slot. And all he has to do is raise up, pull off a caddisfly or a mayfly, and then just go straight back down. And every once in a while, there's like a target of opportunity, like a big, nice minnow. Whew, take that. But just stay in the slot. Don't move to the left or don't move to the right, because there's one more meal coming down. One more meal coming down. And that's what the public is right now. The public has been so conditioned. In the future talks, when I take you down that road, down the Reese Committee papers, and the Reese Committee, see, everything was focused on McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, and un-American activities, and creating a saying, McCarthyism, that's actually a bad thing. But remember, the left got that. The Carnegie Endowment got that. They jumped on that. They publicized that. But nobody even knows about the Reese Committee. And thank God for people like Norman Dodd and G. Edward Griffin, because I never would have known. But once I heard, and here you can hear them talking about it.
The details, the specifics that you told the committee at that time.
Well, Mr. Griffin, in that report, I specifically, number one, defined what was, to us, what was meant by the phrase un-American. And we defined that in our way as being a determination to effect changes in the country by unconstitutional means. We have plenty of constitutional procedures, assuming that we wish to effect a change in the form of government or that sort of thing. And therefore, any effort in that direction which did not avail itself of the procedures which were authorized by the Constitution could be justifiably called un-American. That was the start of educating them up to that particular point. The next thing was to educate them as to the effect on the country as a whole of the activities of large endowed foundations over the then past 40 years.
What was that effect, sir?
That effect was to orient our educational system away from support of the principles embodied in the Declaration of Independence and implemented in the Constitution, and educated them over to the idea that the task now was, as a result of the orientation of education, to away from these briefly stated principles and self-evident truths. And that's what had been the effect of the wealth, which constituted the endowments of those foundations that had been in existence over the largest portion of the span of 50 years, and holding them responsible for this change. And what we were able to bring forward was that what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
I'll put a link to their video. Watch the whole freaking interview. Norman Dodd died in 1983. And especially pay attention to, what was her name? Catherine Casey. I always remember that because Bill Casey. Catherine Casey. She was an attorney. She totally lost her mind. She lost her mind. And I could see her losing her mind. If you can be someone who's just so patriotic and feels that your country can do no wrong because you're doing such great things, and most importantly, an endowment, a foundation, helping the people. And then she finds out that those endowments and those foundations are not to help the people. It's to condition the people. Because once you start conditioning a generation, it leads to the next generation. And that generation is easier to manipulate and condition. And when you hijack the education system through entities like the American Historical Association, which was funded and staffed in its beginning by the Carnegie Endowment, you have some wild, crazy things happening.
You have your letter. We can answer all those questions, but it'd be a great deal of trouble. And we have a counter-suggestion. And our counter-suggestion is that if you can spare a member of your staff for 2 weeks and send that member up to New York, we will give to that member a room in the library and the minute books of this foundation since its inception. And we think that whatever you want to find out or the Congress wants to find out will be obvious from those minutes. Well, my first reaction was they'd lost their mind. I had a pretty good idea of what those minutes would contain, but I realized that Dr. Johnson had only been in office 2 years, and the vice presidents were relatively young men, and counsel seemed to be also a young man, and I guessed that probably they'd never read the minutes themselves. And so I said I had somebody, I would take it. I would accept their offer, and I went back to Washington, and I selected the member of my staff who was on my staff, having been a practicing attorney in Washington, but she was on my staff to see to it that I didn't break any congressional procedures or rules. In addition to which, she was unsympathetic to the purpose of the investigation. She was level-headed and a very reasonably brilliant, capable lady. And her attitude toward the investigation was, what could possibly be wrong with foundations? They do so much good. Well, in the face of that sincere conviction of Catherine's, I went out of my way not to prejudice her in any way. But I did explain to her that she couldn't possibly cover 50 years of handwritten minutes in 2 weeks. So she would have to do what we call spot reading. And I blocked out certain periods of time to concentrate on. And off she went to New York. She came back at the end of 2 weeks with the following in the way of on dictaphone belts. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, we are, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So it's, to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment.
So, Candace, go into the black. Go into the world of black operations. See what more you can find in Huachuca. How many other operators have been killed and processed to make it look like they died in a training accident at Fort Huachuca? Do they still do that anymore? I don't know. Friends have told me. I haven't heard anything from friends. When I say friends, you know what kind of friends I'm talking about. I haven't heard it. They're kind of amazed when I tell them about Fort Huachuca. So maybe this is an eye-opener for Candace and whoever's on her investigation team. Because you don't honestly think she does all her investigation by herself, right? Yeah, that's the thing about having a big team. And we're going to talk about that. So my question is about Candace, and Tucker Carlson. Who funds them? Where does your money come from? And yeah, you can tell me that, oh, well, you make your own money, etc., etc. Well, don't believe it. No. We'll talk about that later. Money. Always follow the money. On that note, Google El Salvador body washing. American servicemen dead. Or KIA. Yeah, put that one in there. And then maybe I'll talk about Colonel Rowe. And some kind and very useful words that he gave me 2 weeks after I was debriefed at the Pentagon at the JCRC POWMI division, which was, what, 2 weeks after I got back from Vietnam in 1984. And his words actually saved my life in El Salvador. I actually wrote about it for a magazine a few years ago. I'm going to bring up that article for you. You can take a look at it. Boy, as I said in the beginning of these coffee talks, I hope you're getting ready. I hope you know what's happening. This is the next evolution of a nation and empire after the heyday. Think of it as kind of like we've gone through the birth of the nation in 1776. We went through the teen years, basically from, 1890s until, well, let's say 1880s until World War I. And then from World War I until end of World War II, I'd say that's a little bit of like, being in your 20s and 30s, in your prime, super duper, and then just really hitting hard in your mid 30s, early 40s. And that would be the 50s and 60s. And then you start hitting your 60s. And then we're going to be hitting our 70s. A lot of people, people don't survive past the 70s. And if you look at it generationally, in the way aging a nation in its latter years, you have indicators. And if you pay attention to those indicators, you can be some of those names that continue on. Like if you look at some ancient names from the UK, from during the time of Longshanks, Henry Longshanks, or from the Medicis in Italy, and prior names before that are extinct because they were so focused that their wealth revolved around the government and the institutions, and they weren't able to make an adjustment from that. And then you had a plague which wiped out a ton of people. And if it didn't kill the rulers of that section, that area of land, it killed the workers. And so you had the rulers who now had to become the workers. And then they couldn't defend it. And so then it got taken over. And then a new ruler comes in. This is how this cycles through. You have all these resets. Pay attention to the reset. Pay attention to what's happening. That's why we're having all these divulsions. We're getting all these secrets coming out. And these secrets are coming out because the nation can no longer keep it totally ziplocked. It's breaking at the seams. It's been breaking at the seams because there's so much weight in there. And the weight can't be supported anymore by the people who have no interest in supporting what is no longer being rewarding. Remember, pain, pleasure. People work on a pain-pleasure principle. If you understand that, you can understand yourself, and you can use that in yourself in order to achieve and surpass. When I used to do success engineering, a lot of tools and techniques I would teach to people who wanted to get into to excel in their experience in life, whether it was financially, physically, etc. These are the principles to understand. What drives you? What drives other people? It's that old saying, to thine own self be true, and to thine own self know thyself. If you know yourself, you understand other people. If you understand other people, then you understand how the world works and why things are happening. Why is Trump acting in this manner? He's totally different from the previous administration. And you see that. And if you don't see that, you're freaking I don't know what kind of drugs you're taking, but it's pretty freaking wild because he's not the same Trump. I saw it happening right when they freaking tried to assassinate him. That's the point where reality hit him in a manner that he could no longer continue on the path on which he was. And I think he got an offer. Offers are made, and people who don't take offers often get killed. JFK is an example of that. Bobby Kennedy is another example of that. Look through history. Kennedy, Reagan. I mean, to think that just some nut job goes and tries to kill somebody of that stature within an institution, within a government. You think that just happens? Oh yeah, some guy just lost his mind, grabbed a gun, got into the depository, or came around the corner, pop, 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 22 Win Mag, lucky. Reagan didn't freaking have it explode. Still, it almost killed him. He almost did die. So the severity of all this is very important. So as the sun's going down right now, I got a bunch of more chores. I'm still trying to warm up. I was out tracking a chicken killer. Yeah. Now I finally have dried out my gun. Freaking went straight in the snow. Oh man. Oil it up. It's good to go. That's the thing about a nice bolt. So again, please, I hope you're doing what you need to do. You don't have to be a millionaire to survive this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do an episode on why the millionaires are actually very likely not going to make it. Zuckerberg, Bezos with their bunkers. I'll put a link to an article I wrote for, who was that? Was it the day? Oh, I wrote it for the Daily Caller. God, 15 years ago? Something like that. It was about bunkers. That link will be down below for you to read. They don't have the images that were originally with the magazine because you know how the magazines continue to change. But I wrote about bunkers so many years ago. It's a good read. Yeah, don't go. I hope you don't have a bunker. Please don't have a bunker. On that note, have a good night. Stay safe. Talk to you tomorrow.